Hello there, my Twilight souls. Tonight, we wander into the shadows behind one of Twilight's greatest mysteries. The hidden truth behind Alice Cullen and her real connection to Aro of the Volturi. Alice is a woman who sees every future except her own past. A vampire whose origins were deliberately erased, whose creator was never named, and whose bond to the most dangerous man in the immortal world may run far deeper than anyone in the saga ever acknowledged. If there's a Twilight story you'd love to fall asleep to next, you can tell me in the comments. I'd love to create it for you. Alright, now let's get cozy. Find your softest pillow. Let your body grow heavy and still. Close your eyes. Breathe in very slowly, and let the quiet dark carry you gently into the hidden truth behind Alice Cullen and the ancient secret she was never meant to remember. She was born into a world that had no language for what she was. The year was 1901. And Biloxi, Mississippi, was a city of salt air and church bells, of magnolia trees and the particular suffocating heat that settles over the Gulf Coast in summer like a second skin. It was a place of deep social order, of rigid expectations about what a person was permitted to be, what a woman was permitted to feel, what a child was permitted to say aloud in polite company. It was a place where respectability was not merely valued but weaponized, where the distance between a good family and a ruined one could collapse in a single afternoon of careless words or inexplicable behavior. It was, in almost every way that mattered, exactly the wrong place to be born with the kind of mind that Mary Alice Brandon had been given. Her family occupied that careful middle ground of southern respectability, not wealthy enough to be above judgment, not poor enough to be beneath it. The Brandons attended church every Sunday without fail, kept a clean and orderly home, maintained the social courtesies expected of their station. Harold Brandon worked in commerce, a man of ledgers and contracts, and the particular pride that comes from having built something modest but stable with one's own hands. Eleanor Brandon managed the household with a quiet competence that was the era's highest compliment for a woman of her class. They had plans for their children, ordinary and decent plans, the kind that assumed the world would remain legible and cooperative. Alice was their eldest daughter, and from the very beginning, something about her resisted the legible and the cooperative. The visions began before she had words for them, before she could have explained what was happening, even if she had possessed the vocabulary and the audience. They came the way weather comes, without invitation, filling her entirely, and then receding and leaving her standing in the middle of whatever ordinary moment had preceded them with the knowledge of something that had not yet happened. She did not seek them. She could not stop them. They arrived with the authority of memory specific and detailed and stubbornly, verifiably accurate. A neighbour's house fire 3 days before the first spark caught. Her mother's illness a week before the fever rose. The arrival of a particular letter, the colour of its envelope, the way her father's face would change when he opened it. Small things and terrible things alike, delivered to her with the same indifferent precision, as though whatever mechanism produced the visions had no understanding of which ones would comfort her and which ones would leave her sleepless and afraid. She said them aloud. She was very young, and she did not yet understand that the truth could become a weight around the neck of the one who spoke it. Eleanor Brandon tried, in those early years, to hold the shape of normalcy around her daughter's strangeness. She told herself the child was imaginative, sensitive. Perhaps she had overheard adult conversations and constructed meaning from fragments. These were the stories Eleanor assembled and reassembled, presenting them to her husband and her neighbours and her pastor with the determined calm of a woman who understands that the story she tells about her family is, in some essential way, the thing that holds the family together. Harold Brandon had less patience for reassembly. He was a man who had organized his entire interior life around the knowable, around the orderly, around the reliable machinery of cause and effect. His daughter's visions did not fit inside that machinery. They were not imaginative. They were not the product of overheard conversation. He knew this, had known it for longer than he was willing to admit, and the knowing sat inside him like a stone he could not swallow and could not spit out. He did not discuss it. He watched his daughter with eyes that held something complicated in them, something that was not quite fear and not quite love and not quite either. The visions grew stronger as Alice grew older. This was perhaps the most relentless quality of the gift. It did not stabilize, did not settle into something manageable. It expanded. The accuracy sharpened. The specificity increased. By the time she was approaching her teenage years, she was not describing vague impressions or general feelings about what might happen. She was describing events in precise detail, with the confidence of someone reporting on what she had already witnessed, rather than what she was merely anticipating. The neighborhood had begun to talk by then. The Brandon family had a strange daughter, the whispers said. She knew things she should not know. She spoke things that came true. The specific texture of those whispers shifted depending on who was doing the whispering, but the direction of them was consistent. Something was wrong with the Brandon girl. Something was not right in her mind, or perhaps in her soul. And in 1911, Biloxi, those two possibilities were not always carefully distinguished from one another. Harold Brandon made his decision in the way that men of his era and temperament made difficult decisions, by selecting the explanation that caused him the least amount of existential disruption and pursuing it with complete conviction. Madness was the available explanation. Madness had the advantage of being medical rather than spiritual, practical rather than metaphysical, something that could be addressed through the appropriate institutions rather than requiring Harold Brandon to revise his understanding of the universe. He signed the papers. He arranged a journey. He told Eleanor what was going to happen, and Eleanor, who had her own kind of grief about it, did not stop him. The asylum sat outside of Meridian, far enough from Biloxi that the distance itself communicated something about the family's intentions. This was not a temporary arrangement, not a brief intervention before Alice was returned to the household. The distance said that she was being placed somewhere permanent, somewhere that the family could visit if they chose to, though the historical record of such visits suggests they rarely chose to. What Alice found inside was not treatment in any meaningful sense of the word. The institutions of that era operated on a logic of containment rather than healing. The patients were managed. Their behavior was suppressed through whatever means the attending physicians considered appropriate. And the physicians of the early 20th century had access to a catalogue of methods that had very little to do with the relief of suffering, and a great deal to do with the enforcement of compliance. Hydrotherapy was among the most common. This involved submersion in water at extreme temperatures, ice cold to provoke shock, scalding to force the nervous system into a kind of exhausted stillness. The theory behind it was more philosophical than medical, rooted in the idea that the body could be reset through sufficient physical disruption. Patients were submerged for hours at a time. They were wrapped in wet sheets and left to dry slowly in cold rooms. They were subjected to these things repeatedly, on schedules determined not by any measurable progress, but by the preferences of their keepers. Physical restraint was continuous. Chemical restraint, the early sedatives and barbiturates, beginning to appear in institutional medicine during Alice's likely years of confinement, was used freely and without the kind of dosage precision that might have minimized harm. And as the 1910s progressed, the earliest forms of electroconvulsive treatment began to appear in the more progressive institutions, delivered without anesthetic, without careful calibration, without anything resembling informed consent. It was administered to patients who were held down by orderlies while the current passed through them, and it was considered, by the standards of the day, an advancement. Alice would have been considered a remarkable case. A patient whose specific presentation involved the accurate prediction of future events was precisely the kind of anomaly that attracted professional attention, that got written up in case notes and discussed at conferences and treated with particular persistence. The visions that were her gift were simultaneously the evidence of her supposed illness. Every treatment aimed at curing her aimed, unavoidably, at silencing the thing that made her extraordinary. The physicians wanted the visions to stop. The visions did not stop. She was small in the way that malnourished children who have been through significant trauma are small, physically slight, easily overlooked, the kind of person whom larger and louder individuals tend to move around without noticing. But her mind was working constantly, processing the visions that arrived regardless of her circumstances, storing information about futures she could see and pasts she was slowly losing access to as the isolation and the treatments and the years accumulated. There were small kindnesses, because there are always small kindnesses even in terrible places. A staff member who brought an extra blanket without being asked. An orderly who paused long enough to hear what she was saying before deciding to ignore it. These moments did not redeem the institution or alleviate the fundamental wrong of Alice's being there, but they existed, and in the absence of most other human connection, they mattered. They were the threads that kept something human and intact inside her. The visions continued, and at some point, in the way that her gift had always worked, arriving without invitation, filling her completely, she began to see something new. Not a neighbor's misfortune, not a family member's grief, something larger and stranger and approaching with a kind of inevitability that felt different from the ordinary futures she had spent her life witnessing. Something was coming toward her, something that moved through the world in a way that did not follow the ordinary rules she had always understood. She would have seen it in pieces, the way her visions always assembled themselves. Fragments first, then larger shapes, then something approaching clarity. A figure, a hunter. Eyes that were dark with a particular kind of hunger that she had no framework for understanding. She would have known, through her gift, that this figure was not coming to help her. She would have known that it was coming for her in the way that something comes for its prey, with patience and certainty, and without the capacity for mercy. James was a tracker of the specific and obsessive kind. His gift was the pursuit itself, the following of a thread through whatever complications presented themselves until the thread reached its end. What drew him to Alice is not entirely clear in the canon, but the suggestion is that her gift was somehow detectable to him, that something about her human mind read differently than ordinary prey, that the extraordinary quality of her consciousness announced itself to his particular sensitivity, the way a rare scent announces itself on a crowded street. He moved toward her the way water moves toward the lowest point, not because he chose to specifically, but because that was simply the nature of what he was. He came to the asylum. He came for her. And what stood between Alice and the end of her human story? The only thing that stood between them was someone else. Someone who arrived before James could finish what he had started. Someone who understood what Alice was, what her gift represented, what her survival would mean. Someone who made a choice on her behalf that she was in no position to make for herself. The someone turned her. 3 days of transformation, of the fire that rewrites human biology at the cellular level, of the body simultaneously dying and becoming something that cannot die. 3 days of burning in a place designed to contain the inexplicable, surrounded by the sounds of an institution that would have had no language at all for what was happening in whatever hidden corner the transformation took place. And at the end of those 3 days, Alice opened eyes that saw everything with supernatural clarity and remembered nothing of what had come before. Not her mother's face, not her father's decision, not the journey to Meridian, not the years inside those walls, not the treatments or the small kindnesses, or the visions that had defined every year of her conscious existence. Not even the sensation of her own name, Mary Alice Brandon, spoken in the voice of someone who knew her as a child. Gone, all of it gone, replaced by a blank so complete and so surgical that it did not feel like forgetting. It felt, if anything, like a door that had been closed from the outside and locked, the key removed, the keyhole filled over so smoothly that unless you pressed your fingers against the wall and searched very carefully for the seam, you might not know the door had ever existed. She was alone when she woke. No one waiting to explain. No one to tell her what she was or where she was or what had happened to the life she no longer had access to. Just the new senses, overwhelming and magnificent and terrifying, and the thirst that came with them, and the visions, still there sharper than ever, showing her futures with a clarity that her human nervous system could never have sustained. And somewhere in those first visions, in those first fractured hours of her new existence she had no context for, she began to see something warm and golden at the edges of the futures available to her. A family, a place, a man with waves of honey-coloured hair and eyes the colour of storms, who would look at her as though she were the thing he'd been wandering toward without knowing it. She moved toward that vision, the way she had always moved toward what she saw, with trust, with certainty, with the absolute conviction of someone who has learned through long suffering that the visions do not lie. She did not ask who had made her. She did not know that the question was available to her. She did not know that somewhere behind her, in the direction of the past she could no longer access, there was a name she had never been given. A name that would, if she had known to look for it, explain a great deal about the path that lay ahead. That name remained in the dark, and the dark, as it turned out, was very patient. The canonical facts of Alice's transformation can be stated simply in a handful of sentences. Someone intervened. James was thwarted. Alice was turned. She woke alone, with no memories of her human life, guided only by the visions that her gift had already begun reshaping into something vast and precise and supernaturally reliable. That is what the canon gives us. And if you hold those sentences at a certain angle, in a certain light, they seem sufficient. They seem like enough of a story to account for the blank space where Alice's human life should have been. Someone saved her. She survived. She found her family and built something beautiful from the ruins of what she had lost. But hold those same sentences at a different angle, and the simplicity of them begins to feel less like clarity and more like concealment. Because the more carefully you examine what we are told, the more the shape of what we are not told becomes visible. The way a figure becomes visible in a dark room, not because the light falls on it, but because the shadows around it arrange themselves in the outline of a human form. Start with the transformation itself. The process of becoming a vampire is one of the most viscerally detailed elements of the Twilight canon. Maya describes it repeatedly, across multiple books and from multiple perspectives, with a consistency that suggests she considered it with great care. The venom enters the bloodstream. It spreads. It follows the pathways of the circulatory system to every cell, every organ, every nerve ending, rewriting what it finds there. Human biology is not simply killed. It is converted, replaced piece by cellular piece, with something designed to last forever. And the fire, always the fire. Every vampire who has undergone the process and survived to speak about it uses the language of burning, because there is no other language adequate to what happens. The body is not gently transformed. It is taken apart and rebuilt at a temperature that the conscious mind experiences as the end of everything. 3 days, always 3 days. The fire moving through every system until there is nothing left that it has not touched and changed and made permanent. Alice burned for 3 days inside an institution that would have had no framework whatsoever for what was happening to her. The asylum in Meridian was a place designed to contain human suffering, human madness, human behavior that deviated from the acceptable. It was not designed to contain the transformation of a human being into something categorically other. Whatever hidden room, whatever carefully arranged corner her mysterious savior had prepared for this to happen. And it must have been prepared, must have been planned in advance, because the transformation cannot be performed quietly in an open ward. She burned there alone, in the dark, with the sounds of the institution moving around her and the fire moving through her, and no one waiting on the other side of it to explain what she would find when she opened her eyes. Think about what that means, measured against the only other transformation the reader experiences in comparable detail when Bella Swan woke in for signs of the pain he could not take, for signs of the pain he could not take from her. He had spoken to her, quietly, steadily, his voice a thread she could follow through the fire back towards something recognizable. At one point, during those 3 days, when Bella's suffering had reached a pitch that tested everyone in the room, Edward leaned close and said, very quietly, that it was almost over, that she was almost through it, that he was there and would not leave. The words were small, but they were there. They existed. There was something she could hold on to when the burning made everything else inaccessible. Alice had no such words. Alice had no voice at all on the other side of the fire, waiting to tell her she had survived something worth surviving. She woke with no human memories, no name she recognized as her own, no face in her mind that she could call home. Just the new senses, overwhelming and magnificent and disorienting, and the thirst that came with them, and the silence where a life should have been. The forgetting was not the normal forgetting of transformation. This is the detail that, once you notice it, refuses to be unnoticed. Maya describes the phenomenon in enough detail across her books to establish that the ordinary vampire transition, however much it changes a person, does not typically strip the human memories entirely. They persist. They soften over decades, grow distant and quiet, feel less like lived experience and more like stories about someone else. But they persist. Edward remembers Chicago in 1918. He remembers the smell of the epidemic moving through the streets, remembers his father's face, remembers his mother's hand in his. Rosalie remembers every detail of her human life with a vividness that has never dimmed. Carlyle remembers the grey London streets of the 1600s. Jasper remembers the weight of his Confederate uniform, the particular heat of a southern afternoon in 1863. They all remember. The memories change in quality, but not in existence. Alice remembers nothing. This discrepancy sits at the center of her story like a stone in still water. The ripples from it move outward through everything, touching details that might otherwise seem unrelated, raising questions that the canon gestures toward and then quietly declines to answer. Was the total erasure of Alice's human memories a side effect of some unusual circumstance during her transformation? Did something go wrong? Some complication arising from the conditions of the asylum, or the presence of James, or some quality of Alice's particular biology that produced this aberrant result? Or did something go very precisely right for someone who needed it to? The visions returned immediately, not in the diminished, uncertain form they had taken during her human years, filtered through a nervous system never designed to carry them. They returned amplified, architectural, almost impossibly precise. The faculty that had shown her a neighbor's house fire as a child now showed her entire webs of possible futures, branching and shifting in real time, updating with each decision made by each person in their radius. It was not the blunt, exhausting instrument of her human precognition. It was something refined and deliberate, the way a rough stone becomes a lens when it has been cut correctly. And in those first hours, waking alone in a place she could not name with a past she could not access, the visions showed her something specific. A family, golden-eyed and careful, living at the edge of a forest in the grey light of the Pacific Northwest. A man specifically, lean and worn with a history of violence he was trying to set down, who would look at her as though she were the fixed point he had been wandering toward without knowing it. She moved toward what she saw. This was simply what she did, what she had always done even as a human child in Biloxi. The visions did not lie. The visions had never lied. Even when no one believed them, even when following them had cost her everything a human life could cost, they had always been accurate. She had no past to navigate from, no identity to construct herself around, no name she was certain of. But she had the vision, and the vision was enough. She found Jasper in a diner in Philadelphia, 1940s, a man so hollowed out by decades of violence that he had almost stopped trying to be anything else. She slid into the seat across from him and smiled, and he stared at her, and she said simply that he had kept her waiting long enough. The words contained everything: the years of visions, the certainty, the particular relief of arriving at the future you have been watching approach for so long. He did not fully understand it, but something in him recognized it anyway. He went with her, because whatever she was, whatever she knew, she looked at him as though his past was not the most important thing about him. That alone was nearly enough. Together, they found the Cullens. Alice presented herself and her companion to Carlyle with the directness that had always characterized her, the absence of ordinary social hesitation that came from already knowing how the conversation was going to go. She told him she had seen his family, seen the life they had built, seen the choice they had made about what kind of creatures they were going to be, and decided that it was the choice she wanted to make as well. Carlyle looked at her for a long moment, reading her the way he read everyone who came to him, with a particular attentiveness of a man who had spent centuries deciding whom to trust. "You saw us," he said finally, "in a vision." "Many visions," Alice told him, "for a long time." He asked where she had come from, and she told him the truth, which was that she did not know. She had woken alone. She had no human memories. She had the visions and the thirst and the certainty about his family. And beyond that, the beginning of her story was a blank she could not read. Carlyle accepted this with a generosity that characterized everything he did. It was enough that she was here. It was enough that she was choosing the same careful, difficult path he had spent centuries walking. The past was not interrogated further. The gap was not treated as suspicious. It was treated as a wound, and wounds deserved gentleness rather than examination. And so, the unnamed Turner remained unnamed. The question of who had made Alice, who'd been present at the most important moment of her existence, and then vanished without leaving so much as a name. This question settled quietly into the foundation of the Cullen family's story about itself, and was not disturbed. The canon does not disturb it either, not directly, but the canon if you read it carefully, keeps returning to the edges of that blank space in ways that feel less like coincidence and more like an author circling something she has not yet decided how to reveal. Because in a saga that names everyone, that gives backstory and motivation and history to characters who appear for a handful of pages, that traces bloodlines and coven allegiances across thousands of years of vampire society, the person who created Alice Cullen has no name. The person who chose her specifically from among all the humans in the world who were suffering or hunted or living in obscurity. The person who arrived at the asylum in Meridian, Mississippi in the early years of the 20th century and made a decision that changed the course of every significant event that followed in the entire saga. This person does not have a name. In the language of literary analysis, an absence this deliberate, this sustained, this surrounded by otherwise meticulous detail is not an oversight. It is a door left ajar. It is an invitation to look at what the light reveals when it falls through the opening and illuminates the shape of what has been standing in the dark this entire time. Alice herself cannot look through it. That is perhaps the most quietly devastating aspect of her situation, the detail that turns the theoretical into the personal. She has a gift that shows her every future that branches forward from the decisions being made around her. But it cannot look backward. It cannot illuminate the past that was taken from her. She can see everything that is coming, and nothing at all of what has already been. She knows she was turned. She knows someone chose to save her rather than let James finish what he had started. She knows that this unknown person had enough knowledge of her situation, enough awareness of James's pursuit, enough capability to intervene effectively, to arrive at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place and transform the outcome entirely. She knows all of this the way you know the shape of a room you cannot see by running your hands along the walls in the dark and inferring the dimensions from what your fingers find. What she does not know, what she has never known, is why. Why her? Why then? Why the memory was taken along with the human life? Why the person who gave her immortality did not stay to witness what they had made? She has lived with these questions for over a century without answers. A century of seeing and knowing and anticipating, of being the most informed person in any room about what is going to happen next, while being the most ignorant person in that same room about where she came from and who made her and what purpose, if any, the making was intended to serve. The unnamed Turner left to her in the most essential way, in the dark. And somewhere in that dark, patient as stone, old as the hills above a certain Italian city, a name waits. It has always been waiting. It knew from the very beginning exactly how long it would need to wait, and for what, and why the waiting was worth it. It had, after all, read the memories of thousands of vampires across 3 millennia. It understood waiting the way most beings understand breathing. The question is not whether that name exists. The question is whether anyone, in all the years that have passed, has thought to look for it in the right place. The right place, it turns out, is not in Alice's past. It is in her future. It is in the specific shape of the futures she has always been shown. The particular destinations her visions have always pointed her toward. The invisible hand that has guided her sight since before she understood that sight could be guided at all. That is where the name lives, and that is where we are going next. To understand why Aro is the leading suspect in the mystery of Alice's creation, you must first understand Aro himself. Not the surface version, not the theatrically gracious figure who receives guests in the throne room at Volterra with open arms and warm words and eyes that hold something ancient and cold behind their warmth. You must understand what he is beneath the performance, what he has been building across 3,000 years of careful, patient, methodical existence, and why a gifted human girl in an asylum in Mississippi in 1901 would not have been beneath his notice. Nothing in Aro's long experience was beneath his notice. That was precisely the point. That had always been precisely the point. He was one of three. Aro, Caius, and Marcus founded what would become the Volturi in the ancient world. In the centuries when the civilization gathering itself around the Mediterranean was still young enough that a small group of immortal beings could insert themselves into its structures without leaving the kind of historical record that later centuries would demand. Volterra, the hill city in Tuscany, became their seat. It remains their seat today. The stone corridors beneath it, unchanged across millennia. The guard rotating through centuries of service, while the three ancient ones at the center remain fixed and permanent as the stone itself. Tourists walk the cobbled streets above without knowing what moves in the dark below. The city has learned, across centuries of proximity, not to look too carefully at certain doors. Caius was always the crueler of the three in the most legible sense, the one whose violence was closest to the surface, whose enjoyment of enforcement was least disguised. He believed in rules the way a man believes in the weapon he carries, not for their moral weight, but for the power they conferred on the one authorized to enforce them. Caius did not love the law. He loved what the law permitted him to do. Marcus was always the most distant, hollowed out by a grief so old and so total that it had become his defining characteristic, a man present in the body while something essential had long since departed. His gift was the perception of emotional bonds between people. He could see the threads that connected one person to another, their strength and their nature, the way they shifted and frayed and occasionally snapped entirely. He had watched his own most important bond snap centuries ago, and the world had never recovered its color for him since. He sat on his throne and observed and felt the connections between the people around him, and cared about almost none of what he witnessed. And Aro was always the most dangerous, because Aro was the one who understood that information was a more reliable form of power than violence. Violence could be resisted, escaped, outlasted, avenged. Information could not. Information was permanent. Information was the foundation on which every other kind of power was built, and Aro had spent 3,000 years accumulating it with a patience and a thoroughness that had no parallel in the vampire world or any other. His gift made this possible in ways that no other ability in the known vampire world could have replicated. Single touch, skin against skin, his hand closing around another's, and he read everything. Not the surface thoughts available to Edward, the running commentary of the present moment. Everything. Every memory the person had ever formed, every experience they had ever had, every secret they had ever kept, every truth they had ever known and forgotten and known again. The entire contents of a mind, laid open to him completely and permanently, retained in his own memory, with the same fidelity as the original. He had touched thousands of hands across 3 millennia. Thousands of complete minds absorbed and catalogued and cross-referenced against one another, building an internal library of human and vampire experience that was simply without equal anywhere in the world. He knew things about the nature of vampire gifts that no one else knew, because he had read the first-hand experience of hundreds of gifted vampires and could compare them across centuries, could trace the patterns in how abilities manifested and developed, and what conditions produced the most extraordinary results. He knew which gifts amplified under stress and which ones collapsed. He knew which abilities responded to deliberate cultivation and which ones operated best when left entirely alone. He knew the difference between a gift that appeared powerful on the surface and one that was genuinely transformative at depth. This is not a minor detail. This is the foundation of everything that follows. Because what Aro's accumulated knowledge gave him, beyond the raw intelligence of thousands of absorbed minds, was the ability to recognize potential before it had fully declared itself. He knew what a developing gift looked like from the inside. He knew how precognition felt to the person experiencing it before they had any framework for understanding what it was. He knew the specific quality of a mind that was processing information about the future rather than the present, the particular texture of a consciousness that was not entirely located in the moment it occupied. He had read minds like that before, several of them. He had absorbed their experiences, their confusions, their gradual realizations about what they were and what they could do, and he had stored all of it with the careful precision of someone who understood that every piece of knowledge would eventually find its use. He would have known with certainty what he was looking at if he encountered a precognitive human. He would not have needed to study the situation or consult with others or weigh the evidence. The recognition would have been immediate, the way a collector recognizes a rare piece the moment it comes into view, before anyone else in the room has registered that something significant is present. He built the guard on exactly this kind of recognition. The Volturi's inner circle is not assembled through ordinary recruitment. It is assembled through identification, the spotting of gifts in their early or undeveloped stages, and the deliberate acquisition of the gifted before anyone else could reach them. Jane and Alec were human children when Aro found them, twins with nascent abilities that the villagers around them had already begun to find threatening. The village wanted them destroyed. They were different, and difference in a small, frightened community tends to resolve itself through violence. Aro intervened before the violence could conclude what it had started. He turned them. He gave them immortality and purpose, and absolute loyalty to the people who had saved them, and in return he received 2 of the most powerful offensive weapons in the vampire world, bound to him with a devotion so complete it had never once wavered across the centuries since. Chelsea could alter the emotional bonds between people, strengthen loyalties, dissolve connections that might otherwise lead to resistance or departure. Aro found her and understood immediately what she could be. Renata could deflect physical and mental approaches to whoever she was protecting, a living shield that operated below the threshold of conscious intention. Aro found her as well. Corinne produced a contentment in those around her, a chemical satisfaction with their circumstances that made the long service of the guard sustainable in a way it might not otherwise have been. Aro found her and recognized what she offered, and incorporated her into the structure he was building with the same methodical care he brought to every acquisition. The pattern is consistent across every member of the inner guard, whose backstory is even partially known. Aro identified them. Aro acquired them. Aro built his collection piece by piece across centuries, with the patience and the foresight of someone who understood that the most valuable things in the world could not be seized by force, but had to be gathered carefully and slowly over time. Force created enemies. Patience created gratitude. Gratitude properly cultivated created loyalty. And loyalty, in Aro's understanding of the world, was the only currency that did not eventually devalue. He did not limit his searches to the vampire world. This is important, and the canon is clear enough about it to make the point without requiring interpretation. Aro was aware of gifted humans and interested in them specifically because the transformation process tended to amplify human abilities into something far beyond their original scope. He had read enough minds containing the early stages of various gifts to understand the relationship between the human expression of an ability and its vampire expression. A human with an unusual sensitivity to others' emotions might become, after transformation, a full empath capable of manipulating entire rooms with a thought. A human with occasional accurate intuitions about future events might become something whose precision and range exceeded anything previously documented. The potential embedded in gifted humans was, in Aro's assessment, consistently undervalued by the rest of the vampire world. Most vampires were not looking for humans with unusual abilities. They were looking for food, or for companions, or occasionally for political leverage. Aro was looking for something else. He was looking for the next piece in a collection that he had been assembling for 3,000 years, and he was patient enough to search in places that other vampires would never think to look. The Volturi had historically maintained awareness of human populations in ways that their official posture of detached superiority was designed to obscure. They monitored. They had networks of information flowing toward Volterra from across the world, maintained by human servants called the Daylight Guard, by vampires who owed them fealty and reported regularly, and by the accumulated intelligence that Aro had personally absorbed from every mind he had ever touched. Those thousands of minds contained their own networks, their own sources, their own knowledge of the world, all of it now accessible to Aro and cross-referenced against everything else he knew. Information about unusual humans, about people whose behavior suggested gifts that had not yet been given the proper vessel to reach their full expression, would have moved through those networks the way all information moved. Toward Volterra, toward the stone room where Aro sat, with his accumulated thousands of absorbed minds, and waited with perfect patience for the world to bring him what he needed. An asylum in Mississippi in the early 1900s, housing a young woman whose documented behavior included the repeated and verifiable accurate prediction of future events, would not have been invisible to a network like that. The institutional records of the era were not private in any meaningful sense. Case notes traveled between physicians. Unusual cases were discussed at conferences. written up in the emerging professional literature of psychiatry, shared among colleagues as examples of particularly interesting presentations. A patient whose specific documented symptom was verifiable precognition, whose predictions had been recorded and had come true repeatedly, with a specificity that the attending physicians found inexplicable and therefore classified as elaborate delusion, would have generated exactly the kind of documentation that found its way through channels that left no obvious trail to someone who knew how to read it correctly. Aro would have known how to read it. He would have recognized the description with the immediate certainty of someone who had absorbed the first-hand experience of precognitive minds and understood from the inside what it felt like, what it looked like from the outside, how it manifested in a human nervous system not built to contain it. He would have known that what the Mississippi physicians were documenting as elaborate delusion was something else entirely. He would have known what it could become. He would have known about James as well. Trackers of James's particular obsessive variety were not common, but they were known quantities within the vampire world, and the Volturi made it their business to know about known quantities. A vampire whose gift drew him specifically toward extraordinary prey, who pursued gifted humans as preferred targets, whose activities left a trail of unusual disappearances, rather than the ordinary patterns of vampire feeding. This was the kind of creature whose movements Aro would have tracked as a matter of practical interest. Anywhere James directed his attention, something worth noticing had preceded him. James was, in a sense, an involuntary scout for anyone patient enough to watch where he went. The confluence of these two facts, a gifted human girl in an asylum in Meridian, Mississippi, and a tracker moving toward her with the focused intention that James brought to every pursuit, would have presented itself to Aro not as a crisis requiring emergency response, but as a situation ripe for management, careful management, the kind that left no fingerprints and produced outcomes that looked, to any outside observer, entirely like the natural unfolding of events. This is how Aro thought. This is how he had always thought. 3,000 years of turning situations to his advantage had produced a mind that did not experience events as things that happened to him, but as materials he worked with. The way a master craftsman approaches whatever the day presents, finding a use for every piece, wasting nothing, understanding that the value of a material is often not in what it appears to be, but in what it can be made to become in the right hands. Consider what the situation in Mississippi offered him. A precognitive human of apparently extraordinary ability, judging by the documentation, in a location and condition that made her simultaneously vulnerable and inaccessible to ordinary discovery. Vulnerable because the asylum offered no real protection against a determined vampire. Inaccessible because no one who might have recognized her gift for what it was and acted on it with good intentions was looking in that direction. Carlisle Cullen, who had spent his immortal life watching for humans in distress and responding with compassion, was not monitoring the institutional records of Mississippi psychiatric facilities in 1901. Aro was. The question of what the most useful possible outcome looked like from Aro's perspective is where the theory becomes genuinely interesting rather than merely plausible, because the most useful outcome was emphatically not simply saving the girl and bringing her to Volterra. That would have been the obvious move, the direct move, the move that a less subtle operator, one with less than 3,000 years of accumulated understanding of how power actually works, might have made. Bring her in, turn her, add her to the guard, absorb her gift into the collection. Direct, efficient, and for someone of Aro's particular genius, entirely wasteful. Because a seer who knows she was made by Aro, who has always known it, who has grown up inside the Volturi structure with full awareness of her own history and her own debt, is a known quantity. She is visible. Her loyalty can be managed, her ability can be directed, but she is a piece on the board that everyone can see, including her. A seer who does not know is something else entirely. A seer with no memory of her origins, who believes herself to be self-made, who has been guided by her own visions toward a life and a family and a set of relationships that feel entirely organic and freely chosen. This is a piece that moves itself, that generates its own intelligence without being directed, that reports on the future without knowing she is reporting, that is embedded in the most interesting and potentially significant coven in the world without any visible thread connecting her to the one who placed her there. Aro understood something about information that most people, human or vampire, never fully grasp. The most valuable intelligence does not come from assets who know they are assets. It comes from people who believe completely in their own freedom. People who act on their own instincts, their own loves, their own loyalties, produce behavior that is genuine and therefore genuinely informative. They cannot be detected by anyone watching for signs of planted allegiance, because there are no signs. The allegiance does not exist. Only the placement does. Whether Alice was that placement is the question at the heart of everything that follows. The evidence is not conclusive. It is suggestive in the way that the most interesting theories are always suggestive. Almost too coherent to be accidental. Almost too neatly fitting the profile of the man at the center of it to be dismissed as coincidence. And that man, sitting in his stone chair beneath the Tuscan hills, has never in 3,000 years of careful and deliberate existence done anything by accident. Every acquisition was intentional. Every gap in the record was chosen. Every name that was withheld for a reason. The collector of souls does not misplace his acquisitions. He does not forget to leave a name. Unless the name itself was the thing he most needed to conceal. Unless the absence of the name was, from the very beginning, the most important part of the plan. Every theory requires evidence, not the kind that fills a courtroom and satisfies a legal standard, but the kind that accumulates quietly across a body of text, detail by detail, until the weight of it becomes difficult to dismiss. The case for Aro's connection to Alice is built from exactly this kind of evidence. No single piece of it is conclusive on its own, but the pieces do not exist independently of one another. They form a pattern, and the pattern has a shape, and the shape, once you have seen it clearly, is very difficult to unsee. Begin with language. Begin with the specific words Aro uses about Alice, because Aro is a man who has spent 3,000 years choosing his words with the precision of someone who understands that language is a form of action. He does not speak carelessly. He does not reach for the approximate word when the exact word is available to him. Every phrase he produces is selected, weighed, and deployed with intention. which makes a phrase he uses about Alice in Breaking Dawn worth examining very carefully indeed. When Alice and Jasper leave the Volturi sphere of influence permanently, departing after the confrontation in the clearing rather than accepting the invitation to join the guard that Aro had extended with such persistent warmth, he describes them in a way that stops the careful reader entirely. He calls them the precious ones that got away, not the useful ones, not the valuable assets, not even the powerful ones, which would have been the most straightforwardly political framing available to him. Precious. The word is intimate in a way that the surrounding context does not explain. Precious is what you call something you loved. Precious is what you call something whose loss registers not as a tactical setback, but as a personal diminishment. 3,000 years of careful language, and the word he reaches for when he loses Alice is precious. This is the first pillar of the case, not because one word proves anything by itself, but because it establishes a tone, a register of feeling that runs beneath every interaction Aro has with Alice across the entire saga, and which no purely political relationship adequately explains. The second pillar is the pattern of Aro's attention to Alice across the books. Track it from the beginning. When Aro reads Edward's memories in the throne room in New Moon, the moment he encounters Alice in those memories, his response is immediate and disproportionate. He does not process her the way he processes the other Cullens. With interest, with assessment, with the calculating appreciation of a collector evaluating potential acquisitions. He responds to Alice with something that Edward, reading his thoughts, cannot fully categorize. There is a layer to Aro's feelings about Alice that resists Edward's gift, that sits beneath the surface of his thoughts in a way that suggests it is older and deeper and more protected than ordinary tactical interest. In the throne room, when Alice is physically present before him, and he takes her hand and reads her completely, his reaction is described with an emotional weight that exceeds anything the political situation requires. He holds her hand longer than necessary. He is reluctant to release it. When he finally does, there is something in his manner that the text describes as close to grief, as though he has just confirmed something he had been hoping would not be confirmed, or confirmed something he had been waiting a very long time to verify. He wants her to stay. He asks her to stay with an urgency that is not entirely explained by her usefulness as a seer, because Aro has survived 3,000 years without Alice's particular gift, and could presumably continue to do so. The wanting is personal. It has the quality of someone asking a person to come home, rather than asking an asset to join a team. She declines, and he lets her go, which is itself a significant data point, because Aro does not let things go. Aro has enforced his laws with absolute cruelty when they were broken, has destroyed entire covens for lesser violations than the one the Cullens represent simply by existing as they do. He has the power to compel Alice's presence if he chooses to exercise it. He does not choose to. He watches her leave with those eyes that hold something ancient and complicated in them, and he lets her walk out of Volterra, and he calls it the will of the majority with a smile that does not reach whatever is happening in the depths of his expression. The third pillar is the memory wipe, reconsidered now with full knowledge of what Aro's gift makes possible. Aro has read thousands of minds. Among those thousands, He has absorbed the complete memories of vampires who were turned under unusual circumstances. Vampires whose transformation involved complications. Vampires whose human memories were affected in various ways by various factors. He has, in his internal library of absorbed experience, more information about the mechanics of vampire transformation than anyone else in the world. He would know whether total memory erasure was a natural possibility. He would know what conditions could produce it. He would know, if he chose to engineer it, what would be required. The surgical completeness of Alice's memory loss is the detail that the theory cannot release, because it is not just that she forgot. It is that she forgot everything, uniformly without exception, leaving no fragment of her human life accessible. Bella, after her transformation, retained her human memories with crystalline clarity, noting that they seemed sharper and more detailed than they had ever been during her human life. Other vampires described the process of their human memories fading as gradual, taking decades, happening at the edges first, and moving slowly inward. Alice woke with nothing. Not a fragment, not an emotional impression, not the ghost of a familiar smell, not the shape of a face she could not name. Nothing. There are two possible explanations. The first is that something went uniquely and catastrophically wrong during her transformation. Some combination of circumstances that produced a result never documented before or since in the canon. The second is that the result was not an accident at all. That someone who understood the mechanics of transformation deeply enough to engineer a specific outcome had arranged for this particular outcome deliberately, not as cruelty, as necessity. Because a version of Alice who remembered her human life would remember the person who turned her, would remember the face and the name and the circumstances, would carry into her new existence the knowledge of her own origins. And that knowledge, in the wrong context, in the wrong ears, could unravel everything. The fourth pillar is the absence of the name itself. Return to now with the full weight of what we know about Arro's methods and the Volturi's historical relationship to documentation. The Volturi have maintained their secrecy for 3,000 years. They have done this not through the destruction of all records, but through the careful management of which records exist and what they contain. Arro, who has absorbed the memories of thousands of minds, understands better than anyone how information persists, how it travels, how a name attached to an action becomes a thread that can eventually be followed back to its source. Maya names everyone. She named Garrett, the American nomad who appears for a handful of chapters in Breaking Dawn and contributes a speech to the assembled witnesses. She named the Romanian coven members, Vladimir and Stefan, ancient and bitter and largely irrelevant to the plot's resolution. She named nomads who cross the narrative for a page and vanish. She named the Volturi Guard members, gave them histories, gave them abilities, gave them enough individual existence to be distinguishable from one another. The Twilight saga is populated with named characters who occupy its margins, given enough identity to feel real even when they serve minimal narrative function. Alice's creator has no name. This person, who made one of the saga's most central characters, who intervened at the moment that determined the entire shape of Alice's existence, who chose her specifically and transformed her and then vanished from the record entirely. This person is referred to only in the passive voice. She was turned. She was saved. the actor disappears behind the action, which is precisely what you would expect if the actor had very good reasons for disappearing. The fifth pillar is the specific nature of Alice's gift, measured against the specific gap in Aro's intelligence apparatus. Aro's gift gives him the past, complete and total access to every memory that has ever formed in any mind he has touched. What it does not give him is the future. He cannot see what decisions are being made before they are made. He cannot anticipate the moves of his enemies or his potential rivals until after those moves have already been committed to, which in the vampire world, where everything moves with inhuman speed, can mean the difference between a situation managed and a situation lost. Alice sees decisions. Specifically, she sees the futures that branch from decisions currently being made. She does not see the past, and she does not see fixed events. She sees the living edge of the present, the place where choices are actively being formed, and she sees where those choices lead. This is precisely, exactly, with almost architectural precision, the one capability that would complete Aro's intelligence picture. He has everything before the present moment. She has everything after it. Together, they would constitute something close to total omniscience about the affairs of the vampire world. This complementarity is too exact to be dismissed as coincidence without at least pausing to consider the alternative. Gifts in the Twilight universe are not assigned randomly. They emerge from the dominant quality of the human mind before transformation. Alice's gift emerged from her human precognition. Aro's gift is what it is because of something essential in his nature at the moment of his own transformation, 3,000 years ago. Neither of them chose what they became, but someone could have chosen to bring them together. Someone who understood both gifts well enough to see how they fit against each other, who had the patience and the foresight to engineer a situation in which one gift would serve the other across decades of apparent independence. Someone who understood that the most powerful arrangement was not Alice in Volterra, her ability directed and constrained and obvious to everyone, but Alice in the field, embedded in the most interesting coven in the world, seeing futures that she reported to her family while someone else, someone patient and ancient and very far away, waited for those futures to unfold exactly as anticipated. The sixth pillar is the question of placement itself, which is where the evidence stops being merely suggestive and starts being deeply uncomfortable to dismiss. Alice arrived at the Cullens guided by her visions. This is canonical and uncontested. Her gift showed her Jasper and showed her Carlisle's family, and she followed what she saw with the certainty that had always characterized her relationship with her own sight. But visions, in Alice's particular gift mechanics, show the futures that branch from decisions currently being made. For Alice to have seen the Cullens as her destination in those first hours after her transformation, someone must have been making decisions that pointed toward that outcome. Decisions specific enough and committed enough to generate a clear, strong vision rather than a vague possibility. The vision she followed was not tentative or flickering. It was certain enough that she oriented her entire new existence around it without hesitation. Who was making decisions in 1940s America that were specifically oriented toward Alice ending up with the Cullens? Alice herself had no past to navigate from, no established preferences, no prior knowledge of the Cullen's existence. She was making no such decisions. Jasper was wandering, directionless, making no decisions about his future with any clarity or commitment. The Cullens themselves were not searching for Alice and were not making decisions that would have naturally generated a vision of her arrival. The only party for whom Alice's placement with the Cullens would have been a deliberate and fully committed decision is the party who had arranged the entire situation from the beginning. The party whose commitment to the outcome was total enough to make it appear in Alice's gift as a certainty rather than a possibility. The party who understood how her gift worked well enough to know that a fully decided outcome would present itself to her as inevitable. The evidence does not prove the case beyond all doubt. It cannot, because the canon has been constructed with exactly enough ambiguity to sustain multiple readings, but the evidence builds, pillar by pillar, into something that requires a response more considered than dismissal. Aro's intimate language, his disproportionate emotional investment, the surgical completeness of the memory erasure, the unnamed creator in a saga that names everyone, the perfect complementarity of two gifts that together constitute something close to total knowledge, the mechanics of Alice's placement that require a committed decision maker operating from outside her own consciousness. 6 pillars, each one standing independently, all of them pointing in the same direction, toward Volterra, toward a stone room and an ancient figure and 3,000 years of patience so complete it could wait decades for a single seer to find her way to the family he had chosen for her, never knowing whose hand had guided her home. She arrived already knowing them. This is the detail that gets lost in the warmth of the story the Cullen family tells about itself. The story of gathering, of finding one another, of building something chosen and deliberate from the scattered materials of immortal loneliness. Alice and Jasper appeared on Carlisle's doorstep in the 1940s, and Alice already knew the layout of the house, already knew the names, already knew the particular texture of each person's nature in ways that her visions had delivered to her as intimately as lived memory. She walked into a family she had never met and was immediately, fluently at home. Not tentatively at home, not gradually at home after a period of adjustment and trust building. Immediately, as though she were returning to something rather than arriving at it for the first time. Carlyle met them at the door. He looked at the small, dark-haired woman and the tall, wary man beside her, and he read them the way he read everyone, with the careful attentiveness of someone who had spent centuries deciding whom to trust and had learned that the decision was worth taking seriously. What he found in Alice was straightforward enough to satisfy even his caution. The gift was real. The choice to abstain was genuine. The desire to belong to something good was not performance, but the organizing principle of her entire existence. He asked her how she had found them. She told him she had seen them, in her visions, for a long time. She had seen his family and the life they had built, and the choice they had made about what kind of creatures they were going to be. And she had decided that it was the choice she wanted to make as well. Carlyle studied her for a moment longer. Then he stepped back from the door and said quietly that she had better come in then, that they had been expecting someone, though they had not known who. Alice smiled, and later she would tell Jasper that the smile was because she had already seen him say exactly those words, in exactly that tone, and that hearing them spoken aloud after so many years of watching them approach in her visions was one of the finest moments of her life. This is the emotional texture of Alice's arrival, and it is genuinely beautiful. But the theory asks you to hold a second layer of attention against that beauty, not to diminish it, but to examine what sits beneath it. Because Carlyle's instinct that they had been expecting someone is interesting. Not that he had been expecting Alice specifically, not that any vision or premonition had told him she was coming, simply that the family had an open space in it, a shape that wanted filling, and Alice arrived already fitted to that shape with a precision that felt, to the people inside it, like destiny. Destiny is one explanation for precision like that. Design is another. Carlyle accepted her with the openness that defined him. Esme welcomed her with the maternal immediacy she brought to everything that needed welcoming, folding Alice into the family's warmth before the first evening was over. Already thinking of her as a daughter in the uncomplicated way that Esme thought about the people she loved, Emmett found her entertaining from the first moment, her cheerful certainty a pleasant contrast to Edward's brooding and Rosalie's cool remove. Even Rosalie, who was rarely quick to welcome anyone, softened over time under the persistent sunshine of Alice's personality, the way even the most resistant surface eventually yields to something that keeps returning with patience and good humor. Edward accepted her completely, and this matters more than it might initially seem. Edward could hear everyone's thoughts. He had spent decades navigating the gap between what people presented on the surface and what they actually contained at depth, had grown weary and cynical from the constant awareness of the distance between the two. He did not extend trust easily or automatically, because he had too much information about the interior lives of the people around him to maintain the ordinary human capacity for charitable assumption. He trusted Alice immediately. Her mind was genuine. Her love was genuine. Her commitment to the family was not a performance laid over a different set of intentions, but the actual unmediated content of who she was. Edward, who could not be deceived about the quality of a person's interior life, recognized genuineness when he encountered it, and he encountered it fully in Alice from the first moment her thoughts became available to him. This is the part of the theory that requires the most careful handling, and it is worth slowing down here to be precise about what the theory does and does not claim. Alice is not a spy. She is not knowingly Aro's instrument. She does not report to Volterra, does not transmit intelligence through any channel she is aware of, does not maintain any conscious connection to whatever arrangement may have placed her with the Cullens in the first place. Her love for her family is as real as anything in the saga. Her protectiveness of Edward, her friendship with Bella, her devotion to Jasper, her joy in the collective life they have built together across decades. None of this is performance. None of it is strategy at Alice's level of experience. The theory does not require Alice to be complicit. It only requires that she was placed. And placement does not need the knowledge of the place to be effective. It only needs the knowledge of the one who does the placing. Consider how her gift operates within the family, and what its specific mechanics make possible beyond Alice's conscious intentions. She sees futures based on decisions currently being made. She sees them with extraordinary clarity and range, updating in real time as choices shift and new decisions are committed to. The family uses her gift as their primary early warning system, the mechanism by which they navigate a world that would destroy them if they were ever caught unprepared. Alice's sight is threaded through every significant decision the Cullens make. It is the reason they have survived as long as they have, with as few catastrophic encounters as the record shows. And Alice's sight is, by its very nature, outward-facing. It does not look at the Cullens. It looks at everyone approaching the Cullens, everyone making decisions that will affect the Cullens, everyone in the expanding radius of her gift whose choices are moving toward intersection with her family's lives. She sees the world as it organizes itself around the people she loves, and she reports what she sees to the people she loves, and those reports constitute a running account of the most significant events in the contemporary vampire world as they develop in real time. This account exists. It is generated continuously as a natural byproduct of Alice being Alice and loving her family and using her gift to protect them. It does not need to be transmitted anywhere deliberately. It only needs to be accessible to someone who can read it. An Aro, who can read every memory in a mind with a single touch, needs only one opportunity, one hand held in his, and he has everything Alice has ever seen. Every vision, every warning, every glimpse of every future that has passed through her consciousness since her transformation. A complete record of the vampire world's significant events, filtered through the most accurate precognitive gift in existence, spanning whatever decades have accumulated since Alice first opened her transformed eyes. He got that touch in Volterra. But we are not there yet. Within the family, Alice's gift has a series of specific limitations that the canon documents carefully and that the theory finds quietly remarkable. She cannot see the wolves. The shapeshifters of the Quileute tribe are entirely absent from her sight. When they are involved in a situation, that situation goes dark for her, becomes a gap in what she can see that she has learned to read as his own kind of warning. She cannot see Renesmee. Before Renesmee's existence was known, Alice had no vision of her whatsoever, no warning of what Bella's pregnancy would produce, no glimpse of the being who had come closest of anyone in the saga to triggering full open war between the Volturi and the rest of the vampire world, and she could not see Bella clearly. Throughout the series, Bella existed in Alice's sight as a figure surrounded by interference, her futures difficult to read, her decisions generating visions that were murkier and less reliable than Alice's sight usually produced. 3 significant blind spots, each one attributed in the canon to a different cause. And yet all 3 share a quality the theory notices without quite being able to dismiss. All 3 protect exactly the elements of the saga that would have been most disruptive to any long-term arrangement centered on keeping the Cullen family observable, but not omniscient about their own situation. The wolves are invisible. Renesmee is invisible. Bella is functionally invisible for most of the series. If you are designing a seer as an intelligence asset and you wanted to limit the damage she could do to your own plans while maximizing her usefulness as a monitor of everything else, you would engineer exactly these blind spots. You would ensure she could not see the elements most likely to generate outcomes outside your anticipation. you would leave her gift wide open to everything else, everything that confirmed the picture you were building, while closing it precisely and selectively to the elements that could surprise you. This may be coincidence. The theory suggests it may be the most carefully constructed aspect of the entire arrangement. Jasper's presence adds another dimension that the theory does not always examine as carefully as it deserves. He came to Alice already formed by decades of violence, already shaped by his time commanding newborn armies in the Southern Vampire Wars, already carrying the particular damage of a soldier who had done things he could not undo. He was one of the most combat-experienced vampires on the continent when she found him. He was also one of the most psychologically fragile, his empathic gift making him permeable to the emotional suffering of everyone around him, his past making that permeability almost unbearable to live with. When Alice found him in that diner in Philadelphia, he was barely holding together. He looked up at her and she smiled and said he had kept her waiting long enough, and the words landed in him like something he had not known he was waiting to hear. He stared at her. Then he said, carefully, that he supposed she had been waiting a while. She told him longer than he would believe, and that it did not matter anymore because she was here now, and she had seen where they were going, and it was worth every year of the wait. He went with her, because she looked at him as though his past was not the most important thing about him, and that, for Jasper, was almost enough by itself. He followed her to the Cullens and committed himself to the abstention lifestyle on her behalf, and spent decades struggling against his nature in ways that none of the other Cullens had to struggle quite so visibly. His gift made the struggle harder in some ways. He felt everyone's thirst as well as his own, the empathic feedback creating a compounding pressure that Carlyle, for all his centuries of practice, never had to contend with. But he kept trying. He kept choosing. He kept returning to Alice when the struggle became almost more than he could bear, and she kept holding the vision of who he was becoming with a steadiness that asked nothing of him except that he not stop. In doing all of this, Jasper became something the Cullen family had not previously had. A military strategist with genuine centuries of combat experience. An empath who could read and influence the emotional state of any room he entered, who could feel the intentions of approaching threats before those threats had declared themselves, who could slow or accelerate the emotional momentum of a confrontation in ways that made the difference between a situation resolved and a situation lost. A vampire whose particular skill set was oriented almost entirely toward conflict and its management, embedded now in a family whose previous orientation had been almost entirely toward avoidance of conflict. The Cullens were not a fighting force before Jasper. After Jasper, they were still a family, but they were a family that, if pressed, could fight with a sophistication that matched or exceeded anything the vampire world typically deployed. This mattered enormously when the Volturi's attention eventually turned toward them in earnest. A Cullen family without Jasper's tactical experience would have been a very different proposition in the confrontation of Breaking Dawn. Less capable of organizing a witness gathering, less capable of reading the Volturi's emotional and strategic state as they approached, less capable of presenting exactly the kind of formidable but measured resistance that ultimately gave Aro reason to choose restraint over violence. Alice brought Jasper, Jasper brought capability. The capability shaped the outcome of the most significant supernatural confrontation in the saga. And Alice brought Jasper because her visions had shown her that he was part of the future she was walking toward. From the very first days of her transformed existence, before she had any context for understanding what that future contained. The emotional truth of Alice's life within the Cullen family cannot be reduced to any of this analysis without doing violence to what she actually is as a character and as a person. She loves them. The word is not large enough, but it is the right one. She loves Edward with the fierce, slightly exasperated protectiveness of someone who recognized his loneliness immediately and refused to allow him to remain in it. When Bella entered his life and Alice saw the futures that began to open around that connection, she embraced it with a wholehearted enthusiasm that baffled everyone who expected her to be territorial. She wanted him happy. She had always wanted him happy, and Bella made him happy in ways that Alice's visions had shown her were real and deep and worth any complication they carried with them. She loves Esme with a daughter's devotion that neither of them has ever felt the need to fully articulate, because some bonds do not require articulation. They simply exist, recognized and returned, sustaining themselves on the ordinary currency of daily life. She loves Carlyle's belief in the possibility of goodness in a way that suggests it is not merely admiration, but identification. That Carlyle's conviction that vampires could choose something better than their nature demanded is the conviction around which Alice has organized her entire existence. And she loves Jasper in the particular way that the saga struggles to find adequate language for, because the love between Alice and Jasper is not the dramatic, consuming, world-altering love that Edward and Bella represent. It is quieter, more certain. The love that doesn't need to announce itself, because it has never needed to, because both people involved have always simply known from their first conversation in a diner in Philadelphia that the knowing was mutual and permanent and not subject to the ordinary negotiations of uncertainty. None of this is strategic. All of it is real. The theory does not ask you to disbelieve any of it. It asks you only to hold, alongside the emotional truth of Alice's relationships, a second question: whether the conditions that produce those relationships, the blank memory, the guiding visions, the arrival at exactly this family in exactly this configuration, were as self-generated as they appeared, whether the love is genuine and the placement was still engineered, and whether those two things can be simultaneously true without cancelling each other out. They can. A person can be guided to a destination by a hand they cannot feel and still make that destination genuinely their own. A family can be chosen for someone and still become, through years of genuine devotion and sacrifice and the particular alchemy of people who have decided to belong to one another, the realest thing in that person's world. Alice's family is real. Her love is real. Her gift serves them faithfully and has saved them collectively from dangers they would not have survived without her side. Every one of these things is true, and somewhere at the very edge of all that reality, at the periphery of a story that Alice experiences as entirely her own, patient as stone and old as the hills above a particular Tuscan city, something watches the futures shift and settle. Something that knew before Alice knew anything at all about herself. exactly where she would go and what she would find there and what her presence in that place would make possible. Something that would call her precious when she finally left for good, and mean it in whatever complicated way a being like that is capable of meaning anything. Because you do not call something precious unless it mattered to you. And it is very difficult to explain, on purely tactical grounds, why Alice Cullen should matter to Aro in the personal, almost elegiac way that his language about her suggests she does, unless the connection between them is not merely tactical, unless it is, in whatever sense remains available to someone 3,000 years old and functionally beyond ordinary human feeling, something closer to paternal, unless he made her and watched her and let her go, because letting her go was the only way to keep her useful, and called her precious at the end, when the game had finally run its course, and the piece he had placed so carefully on the board had moved, of its own genuine free will, entirely off it. The gift that served two masters served them both without knowing it served either. That is the theory's most heartbreaking claim, and it is the one that, once considered, is the hardest to set aside. There is a moment in New Moon that the theory has been building toward since the first chapter, a moment when Alice Cullen walks into the throne room beneath Volterra and stands before Aro for the first time in the canonical record, and the two of them occupy the same physical space, and everything the theory has proposed about their connection is either confirmed or complicated by what happens next. It is one of the most carefully written scenes in the saga, dense with detail that rewards close reading, and it looks entirely different once you have spent the preceding chapters understanding what Aro is and what Alice might be to him. To understand how Alice arrives in that throne room, you have to understand what sent her there. The sequence of events begins with Bella Swan jumping off a cliff in Forks, Washington, an act of reckless adrenaline seeking that Alice, watching futures from a distance, misreads as suicide. She sees Bella falling. She sees the water. She does not see Jacob Black pulling Bella from the ocean afterward, because Jacob is a wolf and wolves are invisible to her, and so the vision ends at the fall and offers nothing beyond it. Alice draws the only conclusion the incomplete vision supports. She calls Edward. Edward, in Rio de Janeiro, and unable to reach Charlie Swan's house by phone to verify, draws the same conclusion and makes his own decision in response. He will go to the Volturi. He will ask them to kill him, and if they refuse, he will force their hand by exposing himself in the sunlight above the Piazza dei Priori on the afternoon of the St. Marcus Day festival, when the square will be crowded with tourists and the secret of vampire existence will be impossible to maintain. Alice sees this decision the moment Edward makes it, and she moves. She collects Bella from Forks with the urgency of someone who understands that the margin between intervention and catastrophe is measured in hours, and she drives to the airport and puts them both on a plane to Italy with the focused efficiency that characterizes everything Alice does when the stakes are absolute. She navigates Volterra with an ease that the canon attributes entirely to her gift. She has seen the city in her visions, has seen the route, has seen the timing. She knows which streets to take and which to avoid. She knows how long they have. She moves through the ancient Tuscan hill city like someone reading a map that only she can see, with a sureness of step and a knowledge of the terrain that exceeds what her visions strictly require. The theory notices this: Volterra is not a straightforward city to navigate, particularly not at speed, particularly not on the day of the St. Marcus Day festival when the streets are crowded and the normal patterns of movement are disrupted. Alice gets them through it with a precision that her gift explains, and that the theory suggests might be explained by something additional. A city does not have to be consciously remembered to leave traces in the body's orientation. A place does not have to be known by the mind to be known by something deeper and older than the mind. If Alice spent any part of her human life in proximity to Volterra, or if her transformation contained any element of exposure to the city's geography that the memory wipe subsequently erased, the body might still know the way even when the mind insists it is operating purely on foresight. This is speculative. The theory acknowledges it as speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that the evidence invites rather than forecloses. She reaches Edward in the square with seconds to spare. He has stepped into the light, has allowed the sun to begin its work on his skin, and Bella throws herself at him and presses herself against him and blocks the light with her own body, and the moment resolves. Edward does not die in the sunlight above the Piazza dei Priori. The festival crowd does not see what the sunlight would have revealed. The secret holds, but they are in Volterra, and in Volterra, that means the Volturi already know they are there. Two members of the guard appear almost immediately, Jane and Dimitri, and the invitation they extend is not an invitation in any meaningful sense of the word. They are taken below, into the stone corridors beneath the city, through passages that have not changed in 3,000 years, toward the chamber where Aro waits. Edward can hear Jane's thoughts and Dimitri's thoughts, and the thoughts of every vampire they pass in those corridors, and what he hears is complicated enough that he says nothing, processes it in silence, stores it for examination later. He is reading a world that has its own complete interior life, its own ancient politics and loyalties and unspoken histories, and he is too intelligent not to recognize that he is reading only the surface of it. The throne room is described with the attention it deserves. 3 figures on raised chairs, Caius and Marcus flanking Aro, the guard arranged with the studied casualness of people who are always ready and want you to know it. The room is old in the way that very few things are old. Its age not a quality of its condition, but of its atmosphere, the accumulated weight of thousands of years of decisions made and power exercised, and lives ended settling into the stone like heat into the earth. Aro rises when they enter. This is the first detail that matters. He does not receive them from a seated position, which would be the posture of a ruler entirely confident in his dominance over the situation. He rises, which suggests something more active than mere reception, something closer to anticipation fulfilled. He opens his arms in the gesture that characterizes his public manner, warm and theatrical and deeply misleading about what the warmth actually is. He greets Edward first because Edward is the nominal reason for the situation. He reads Edward's hand with the thoroughness that his gift requires and the satisfaction that his nature produces when a long-held curiosity is finally satisfied. He has wanted to read Edward for years. He reads him completely, and what he finds there is everything he expected and more. And his response is the particular delight of a collector, handling a piece he has coveted for a long time, and finding it even finer than the coveting had suggested. But then he turns to Alice. His manner changes, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself as significant to someone who is not already watching for it. But the change is there. Edward notices it, registers it with a part of his mind that is always cataloguing Aro's thoughts and finding in them a layer of something that resists his gift, something deeper and more protected than the surface thoughts that Aro broadcasts with the conscious ease of a performer who knows he has an audience. Aro takes Alice's hand, and he does not read her the way he read Edward. He does not approach her with the focused, analytical attention of a collector evaluating a new piece. He approaches her with something that carries the quality of recognition, of confirmation, of a person checking on something they made a long time ago and have been watching from a distance and are now, finally, allowed to examine up close with their own hands. He holds her hand longer than necessary. The reading requires only a moment. Aro's gift is not slow, does not require extended contact to function. Whatever time passes beyond the moment of initial reading is not about information gathering. It is about something else, something that the canon describes with a precision that is easy to pass over on a first reading and very difficult to unsee on a subsequent one. When he finally releases her hand, his expression carries something that Edward reads as close to grief. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of proximity to loss, the feeling of someone who is holding something they know they cannot keep, and is taking a moment to feel the weight of that before letting go. He tells Alice that her gift is extraordinary, that it is perhaps the most extraordinary he has encountered in his long existence, and that his existence has been very long and has contained a great many extraordinary things. The words are complementary in the way that all of Aro's words are complementary, carefully chosen and precisely delivered, but they carry an undercurrent that Edward hears and cannot fully decode, a layer of something personal beneath the professional appreciation. He wants her to stay. He asks her to stay with a particular phrasing of someone who already knows the answer but needs to hear it spoken regardless. He describes what her life could be in Volterra, what she could become as part of the Guard, what she could accomplish with her gift properly supported and directed and freed from the limitations that her current situation imposed on it. He makes the case with genuine eloquence, because Aro makes every case with genuine eloquence. 3,000 years of practice having made the art of persuasion as automatic as breathing once was. Alice looks at him steadily and tells him that her place is with her family, that she has seen her future, and it is with them, and she is not interested in revising it. There is a quality to her refusal that she may not be entirely aware of. She's not frightened of Aro. She's not performing courage in the face of fear, the way Bella is frightened and managing it, and the way Edward is managing his own complex response to being in this room with these people. Alice is simply certain. The certainty is the particular certainty of someone whose gift has shown them the future clearly enough that the present, however dangerous, does not destabilize them. She has seen past this room. She knows how this ends. And so she faces Aro with the calm of someone who is not afraid because they have already seen that there is no reason to be afraid. This may be exactly what she appears to be, the confidence of a seer who has read the situation in advance. The theory suggests it may also contain a second truth, operating below Alice's conscious awareness. She is not afraid of Aro because something in her does not experience him as a threat. Something at a level deeper than memory, deeper than conscious recognition, responds to his presence with a particular quality of the familiar. Not safety exactly, but not the cold dread that his presence should logically produce in someone who understands what he is and what he is capable of. Aro accedes to the majority's will. He frames the decision collectively, as he always does when the decision is actually his alone, using the language of consensus to perform the restraint that his own judgment has already concluded is the appropriate response. He lets them go. Edward and Alice and Bella walk out of the throne room and back through the stone corridors and eventually back into the light of Volterra's streets, and Aro watches them leave. What Aro has gained from this encounter is worth cataloguing carefully. He has read Edward's complete mind and confirmed that the Cullen family is everything his intelligence had suggested. A coven of unusual gifts and unusual restraint, politically complicated, strategically significant, worth continued attention. He has read Alice completely. He has absorbed every vision she has ever had, every future she has tracked, every moment of her vampire life as she has experienced it from the inside. He's confirmed the scope and precision of her gift with the evidence of the gift itself rather than the second-hand reports he had been working from previously. He has updated his entire picture of the contemporary vampire world with the most accurate precognitive intelligence available anywhere, and he has let them walk out of Volterra with a human girl who knows the secret of vampire existence, in apparent violation of the law that he enforces with absolute cruelty when he chooses to enforce it. He has manufactured a reason to let them go. Alice's vision of the future, consequences, the majority's decision, the performance of reluctant mercy. But the mercy was never reluctant. Aro let them go because letting them go was the right move, and it was the right move for reasons that had nothing to do with Alice's vision and everything to do with the fact that the Cullen family, where they were, was worth more to him than the Cullen family destroyed or absorbed. He needed them to keep existing. He needed them to keep developing, keep gathering strength, keep moving through the futures that Alice's gift would continue to generate and that he could access whenever he chose to arrange another encounter. He needed them free and in the world and unaware of how carefully they were being watched. He needed Alice where she was. The grief in his expression when he released her hand was real. The theory proposes that it was the grief of a maker watching the thing he made choose, freely and genuinely, and without any knowledge of the choice's full significance. 2. Belong to someone else, to a family that was not his, to a future that he had perhaps arranged, but that had grown through Alice's decades of genuine living and genuine loving, into something he could not have entirely predicted and could not entirely claim. She walked out of his throne room and back toward the light, and he watched her go with eyes that held 3,000 years of patience, and something that complicated patience considerably. Something that was not quite loss, because you cannot lose what was never fully yours to begin with, but something adjacent to it. something that a being 3,000 years old and in possession of more information than anyone else in the world might still, occasionally, feel in the presence of the one thing that consistently exceeded his expectations. She had kept her waiting long enough, Alice had told Jasper in that Philadelphia diner. She'd been waiting longer than he would believe. The theory asks, quietly, whether someone else had been waiting longer still. Whether the figure in the throne room, watching the small, dark-haired seer walk back toward the light she had chosen over everything he had offered, had been waiting since 1901. Since a decision made in the dark, in a hidden room in an asylum in Mississippi, when he had looked at a gifted human girl and understood exactly what she was and exactly what she could become and made a choice that he knew, even then, he would never be able to fully claim the consequences of. He let her go then. He let her go now. He would let her go one more time, in a snow-covered field in breaking dawn, and call her precious when she left, and mean it in the way that only makers can mean it about the things they made and could not keep. Everything the theory has been building toward finds its fullest expression in Breaking Dawn. Not because the final book of the saga contains a confession or a revelation, or any moment where the hidden connection between Aro and Alice is explicitly named and confirmed. It contains none of those things. What it contains is something more compelling than explicit confirmation, because explicit confirmation can be staged, can be performed, can be the product of a character saying what the narrative requires them to say. What Breaking Dawn contains is behavior. Aro's behavior across the full span of the book's events, examined carefully and without the soft focus that the saga's romantic momentum tends to cast over everything, reveals a pattern so consistent and so specific that it becomes very difficult to explain without the theory. Begin at the beginning of the book's central conflict, which is also the beginning of Aro's endgame. The premise is straightforward on its surface. Someone has reported to the Volturi that the Cullens have created an immortal child, a human child turned into a vampire, one of the most absolutely prohibited acts in vampire lore. Prohibited because such children cannot be taught, controlled, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be contained, and have historically caused the kind of exposure that the Volturi exist to prevent. The report, if accurate, would require the Volturi's intervention and the destruction of everyone in the Cullen coven who had witnessed or permitted the creation. The report is not accurate. Renesmee is not an immortal child. She is something that has never existed before in the known history of the vampire world. The biological daughter of a human mother and a vampire father, half of each, growing and developing and capable of reason and control in ways that immortal children categorically are not. But the Volturi do not know this when they begin their march toward Forks. Or rather, Aro does not know this yet. And Aro is the one whose knowledge determines everything. Watch how Aro responds to the situation as it develops. He does not move quickly. The Volturi are capable of extraordinary speed when the situation demands it, have crossed continents in days when the urgency required it. Aro does not move quickly here. He allows weeks to pass. He permits the Cullens to learn of the threat, to respond to it, to begin the process of gathering witnesses from across the vampire world. He watches through whatever network of information flows toward Volterra. As the Cullen family assembles a coalition of vampires representing a broader range of gifts and experience than any single confrontation in recent vampire history has brought together in one place, he is watching them gather strength, and he is letting them. The canonical explanation is procedural. The Volturi move deliberately because they are the law, and the law is not supposed to appear rushed or reactive. They build their case, assemble their force, approach with the gravity befitting an institution that has maintained order for 3,000 years. This is the explanation the saga offers, and it is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because Aro is also watching what assembles itself on the other side of the confrontation. He is cataloguing gifts. Zafrina, with her ability to project vivid sensory illusions. Benjamin, capable of actual physical manipulation of the elements. Kate, whose gift could incapacitate with a touch. Siobhan, whose believed ability to shape outcomes through pure intention, fascinated Aro, even as its existence remained technically unconfirmed. Each witness the Cullens gather is a piece of information about what the contemporary vampire world contains, information that flows toward Aro through his network and through his own observation, as he finally arrives and surveys what has assembled against him. He is shopping. This is the theory's darkest reading of Aro's behavior during the Breaking Dawn confrontation, and it is not without textual support. He is using the confrontation, the legal process, the gathering of witnesses, the elaborate performance of Volturi procedure, as a mechanism for identifying gifts he was not previously aware of and assessing whether they are worth acquiring. The confrontation is real. The legal question is real. But it is also, for Aro, an opportunity. This reading gains support from the specific moment when Aro's attention sharpens most visibly. Not when the Cullens present their evidence. Not when Renesmee is examined and her nature is confirmed. Aro's attention sharpens. His manner becomes most animated and most dangerous when he is cataloguing the gifts arrayed before him. When he reads Bella for the first time and discovers that her shield, which had protected her from every gift directed at her mind, does not protect against his tactile telepathy. When he encounters Benjamin's elemental ability, when he feels, through the assembled crowd, the scope of what the Cullens have gathered, he wants it. Not just Alice and Edward, who've been his desired acquisitions for years. He wants all of it. The entire extraordinary collection of gifts that the Cullens, reputation and relationships have assembled in this snow-covered field in Washington state. He sees, in the gathering before him, the most significant enhancement to the Volturi's power that has presented itself in centuries. But Alice is not there. This is the pivot point of the entire book, the absence around which everything else turns. The Cullen family has spent the weeks before the confrontation in a particular kind of anguish, because Alice left. She left without explaining why, left with Jasper, left a note written in a cramped and hurried hand that told them only to look after each other, and that she was sorry, and that she loved them. She left, and the family she left behind understood her departure as abandonment or as fear, and the understanding hurt in the specific way that betrayal by the person you trusted most always hurts. Edward, reading the note, looked at it for a long time. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said very quietly that she would not leave without a reason. That whatever she was doing, she had seen something, and the seeing had required her to go in a direction she could not explain to them without changing the outcome. Esme asked if he believed that. He said he had to, because the alternative was that Alice was afraid, and Alice did not leave because she was afraid. She had never left because she was afraid. He was right. But what she had seen, what she had understood about the confrontation and her own role in it, was more precise and more strategically sophisticated than the family left behind could fully appreciate in the moment of her absence. Alice had seen what would happen if she was present at the confrontation. She had seen Aro's response to her presence, the way her proximity would shift his calculations, the way the sight of her across that field would tip something in him from procedural patience into active decision. She was too valuable, too wanted. Her presence would not strengthen the Cullen's position. It would weaken it, because it would give Aro a reason to press forward regardless of the legal outcome. He would find a justification. He always found a justification. And the justification would be her. By removing herself, she removed the temptation. She used her own knowledge of her value to him as a strategic instrument, and in doing so, she demonstrated a sophistication about her relationship with Aro that the theory finds remarkable. She did not know the full history. She did not know consciously what Aro might be to her or what she might be to him, but she knew, with the certainty her gift produced, that her presence before him would change everything, that something in the dynamic between them was volatile in a way that endangered everyone she loved. She knew she mattered to him too much, and she acted on that knowledge with the same quiet decisiveness she brought to everything. What she did while absent is the other half of the equation. She found Nawel, the half-human, half-vampire young man living in the Amazon. Proof that Renesmee was not unique, that her kind could exist without the dangers that immortal children represented, that the legal premise for the Volturi's intervention was not merely mistaken, but categorically inapplicable. Nawel was the only evidence that could definitively resolve the confrontation without violence. He was also completely unknown to the Cullen family, unknown to the assembled witnesses, unknown to anyone in the situation except Alice, whose visions had shown her exactly where he was and exactly what his existence meant. She brought him back. She arrived at the confrontation with Jasper beside her and Nawel behind her, and the evidence that ended everything, and the confrontation resolved without the violence that had seemed, until that moment, almost inevitable. This is presented in the canon as Alice being Alice, the seer who sees what others cannot, who acts on her visions with characteristic decisiveness, who, when the long game plays out its final move, because the resolution Alice engineered did not simply save the Cullens. It also denied Aro the justification he needed to act. It forced him, through the elegant introduction of irrefutable evidence, into a position where pressing forward would be politically indefensible even by Volturi standards. Alice saved her family by making it impossible for Aro to have them. The confrontation ends. The Volturi withdraw. Aro stands in the snow and looks at Alice, and the text gives him words that the theory has been waiting for since the first chapter. He calls them the precious ones that got away. The plural holds Jasper in it, because Jasper's gift is genuinely valuable and Aro is too precise to waste a word. But the weight of the phrase rests on Alice. It always rests on Alice. Precious, not useful, not powerful, not valuable. which would be the appropriate word for a tactical loss. Precious. The word belongs to a different register entirely, a personal register. A register that implies a relationship that predates the political. You call something precious when it mattered to you before it was useful to you. You call something precious when the loss of it is not merely a setback, but a diminishment of something you cannot replace with anything the world contains. Aro is 3,000 years old and has touched thousands of minds and absorbed thousands of complete human and vampire lives into his own consciousness. He has experienced second-hand and imperfect fidelity, more loss than any being in the world. He has felt, through the memories he absorbed, every kind of grief that exists. And when Alice walks away from him for the last time, the word he reaches for is the word that means the grief is his own. Consider what it would mean for that grief to be a maker's grief, not the grief of a collector losing an acquisition, though it is that too, but the grief of someone who made a choice in the dark, in a hidden room decades ago, when he looked at a gifted human girl and decided her existence was worth preserving, worth shaping, worth releasing into the world, even knowing she would never know his name. Who watched her from a distance for decades as she became everything he had understood she could become, and more. Who held her hand in a throne room and read her entire vampire life and felt, in the reading, the full weight of what she had made of the existence he had given her. Who could not claim it, who could not say, even in that throne room, what she was to him or what he had been to her at the beginning of everything, who could only offer her a place in his guard and watch her refuse it with the serene certainty of someone who had already seen that her future lay elsewhere, and accept that refusal with the grace of someone who had always known, somewhere beneath the strategy and the patience and the 3,000 years of accumulated intelligence, that she would refuse. Renesmee's existence is the wild card that the theory cannot fully incorporate, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging this directly. If Aro arranged Alice's placement with the Cullens as part of a long-term intelligence strategy, Renesmee represents the element that escaped his planning entirely. Alice could not see her. The Volturi did not anticipate her. Her birth and her nature created a situation that Aro had to respond to reactively rather than proactively, which is profoundly uncharacteristic of everything the theory understands about how he operates. Renesmee is the genuine accident in a story full of engineered outcomes. She is the thing that happened outside the plan, that no amount of precognitive intelligence had prepared anyone for, that forced every party in the situation, Aro included, to improvise in real time. And the improvisation did not go Aro's way. The confrontation he had perhaps expected to resolve in acquisition ended in retreat. The precious ones that got away, got away. The long game ended not with the collection completed, but with the most valuable piece permanently beyond reach, walking across a snow-covered field in Washington State, with her husband's hand in hers, not looking back. The game ended. The player remained. 3,000 years of patience, and the one genuine loss was a small, dark-haired woman whose name had once been Mary Alice Brandon, who had burned in the dark in Mississippi, who had woken alone with nothing, who had built everything from that nothing and chosen it freely and loved it fiercely, and in the end had used her own understanding of her value to the man who may have made her as the instrument of her family's salvation. She never looked back. She didn't need to. She had already seen what lay ahead, and it was everything she had always known it would be. Warm and golden and entirely, completely hers. Behind her, in the snow, something ancient and patient, and perhaps, beneath all the strategy and the theatre and the 3,000 years of careful accumulation, something that felt the particular cold of a loss it had engineered for itself, watched her go, and said nothing, because there was nothing, in the end, to say. The word had already been spoken, the only word that mattered, the word that contained everything the theory has been tracing through 7 acts of careful attention, everything that the evidence points toward, everything that the blank space where Alice's memory should be was designed to conceal, and that the shape of Aro's grief, precise and personal and entirely inadequate to the weight of what it was describing, finally and inadvertently reveals. Precious, the word echoes. The snow settles. The long game is over. What follows is the most speculative territory this script will enter. Everything in the preceding acts has been built from textual evidence, from the canon's own details examined carefully and placed in relationship to one another. The pillars constructed in Act 5 were drawn from specific passages, specific word choices, specific patterns of behavior that the books themselves document. The readings of New Moon and Breaking Dawn in Acts 7 and 8 were grounded in events that actually occur on the page, interpreted through a theoretical lens, but not invented to support it. What follows is different. It is the theory taken to its furthest possible conclusion, the place where the evidence ends and genuine speculation begins. It is presented clearly as such, not because it is less interesting than what came before, but because intellectual honesty requires that the boundary between evidence and extrapolation be visible. The most compelling theories are the ones that know their own limits. And this theory, at its outermost edge, reaches into territory that the canon does not confirm and cannot refute, which is precisely the territory where the most unsettling ideas tend to live. The chess game thesis begins with a simple premise. If Aro turned Alice and placed her with the Cullens deliberately, then he had a plan. Not a vague intention, not a general hope that something useful might develop, but a plan. A specific long-horizon strategic arrangement with defined objectives and anticipated outcomes, built on the foundation of 3,000 years of accumulated intelligence about how the vampire world worked and where its significant pressure points were located. Plans of this scale require foresight. They require the planner to be operating several moves ahead of the current position, to have already modeled the consequences of the initial placement through multiple generations of cause and effect. Aro had the intelligence for this. 3,000 absorbed minds, each one a complete model of a human or vampire life, provided him with the raw material for exactly this kind of deep strategic modeling. He did not need to be certain of specific outcomes. He needed only to understand the landscape well enough to identify which initial conditions would generate the range of outcomes most favorable to his interests. The question the thesis asks is, what did Aro anticipate in 1901 that required a precognitive seer to be embedded in a vegetarian coven in the Pacific Northwest? Begin with Edward. Edward Cullen, Edward Mason, before Carlyle transformed him in 1918, represents what Aro had identified as perhaps the most significant uncollected gift in the vampire world: the ability to read minds in real time, continuously and involuntarily, with a range that extended to every consciousness in the surrounding area. This gift, combined with Aro's own tactile telepathy, would constitute an intelligence apparatus of extraordinary completeness. Aro had the past. Edward had the present. Together they would have everything except the future. Aro wanted Edward with a persistence that the saga documents across multiple books. He had wanted him since Carlyle's time in Volterra, since the early 18th century when Carlyle had lived among the Volturi, and Aro had read him and understood, through Carlyle's memories, the remarkable young vampire Carlyle had created. He had wanted him through every subsequent decade, had tracked his development from a distance, had made his desire known through every channel available. Edward refused, repeatedly and absolutely, and Carlyle's protection made pressing the matter politically complicated. But Alice's placement with the Cullens created a different kind of access. Aro could not read Edward directly without Edward's cooperation. He could read Alice, and Alice's visions contained, within the texture of every future she tracked, the decisions and movements and choices of every member of her family, including Edward, including everything Edward did that was significant enough to shape the futures Alice was monitoring. Alice's gift was not Edward's gift. It did not give Aro direct access to Edward's thoughts, but it gave him something in some ways more useful. It gave him a continuous account of what Edward was doing and choosing and becoming, filtered through the most accurate precognitive lens available. Across whatever decades Alice spent with the Cullens, before Aro's next opportunity to read her directly, he had access to Edward through Alice, not complete access, not the access he wanted, but enough to maintain his picture of the Cullen family's development, enough to track the most significant events in their existence, enough to understand what they were becoming and what that becoming might eventually mean for his plans. Then there is Bella. Bella Swan represents the element of the theory that is simultaneously the most fascinating and the most difficult to accommodate. She is, in the most literal sense, the person in the saga least accessible to Aro's intelligence apparatus. Her shield protects her from almost every gift directed at her mind. She is invisible to Alice for most of the series. Her futures murky and unreliable. Her decisions generating visions that resist the clarity Alice's gift usually produces. She is opaque to Edward's mind reading in a way that no other human is. She is, from the perspective of anyone attempting to monitor the Cullen family through gifts that operate on consciousness, a blind spot in human form. The thesis's most provocative extension is the suggestion that this opacity was anticipated. Not that Aro knew Bella specifically. How could he have known about a girl who had not yet been born when Alice's transformation was arranged? But that the specific mechanics of Alice's blind spots, which protect the most significant human in the saga from being visible through the intelligence channel Alice represented, were engineered with some awareness of the category of person they would eventually protect. This requires Aro to have understood, decades before Bella existed, that Edward would eventually find a human whose significance to him was sufficient to reshape the entire landscape of Aro's plans. It requires him to have understood that such a human, if she were to generate genuinely novel outcomes, rather than simply fulfilling the futures Alice could already see, would need to be invisible to Alice's gift. It requires him to have been operating at a level of strategic foresight that even the theory's proponents acknowledge strains credibility. And yet, Edward spent decades refusing every human connection, rejecting every possibility of attachment, maintaining a distance from human life that his family found painful to witness. The probability that he would eventually find a specific human so compelling that he would overturn every principle he had maintained across 80 years of careful existence would fall into a love so total and so transformative that it would change the direction of the entire saga. This probability was not zero. Aro, who had read thousands of minds and understood the patterns of vampire psychology with a depth that no one else possessed, would have known that the probability was not zero, would have understood that an isolated, profoundly lonely vampire with Edward's particular gifts and Edward's particular damage was eventually, under the right conditions, going to find someone. The only question was when and who. A seer could not see that person would leave the development of that relationship entirely outside Aro's knowledge until it had already produced its consequences. The consequences in the event included Bella's transformation, Renesmee's birth, the Breaking Dawn confrontation, and the permanent departure of the precious ones that got away. These were not outcomes Aro wanted, but the theory's darkest readings suggest that they may have been outcomes Aro anticipated as possibilities within the range of what Alice's placement might eventually produce, accepted as the cost of the longer game he was playing, which was not specifically about Bella or Renesmee, but about something larger. The something larger is the question of succession. This is the territory the theory enters almost reluctantly, because it requires imagining Aro not merely as a collector and strategist, but as someone capable of genuine long-horizon thinking about the mortality, the effective mortality, of even the oldest vampire institutions. The Volturi have existed for 3,000 years, but 3,000 years is not forever. And Aro, who has read enough minds to understand how power structures fail, would know that the conditions sustaining the Volturi's dominance are not permanent. The vampire world is changing. Gifts are becoming more varied, more powerful, more widely distributed. Covens like the Cullens represent a new kind of vampire, social organization, one built on different principles than the Volturi's fear-based hierarchy, one that might eventually generate a different kind of power. A seer embedded in the most progressive coven in the vampire world, monitoring its developments across decades, reporting its significant events through the mechanism of her own memories whenever Aro could arrange access, would give him more advance warning of how the vampire world was evolving than any other intelligence arrangement available to him. It would give him time to adapt, to position, to ensure that whatever the vampire world became, the transition was one that the Volturi navigated, rather than one that swept them away. This is a chess game at its most expansive. Aro not simply managing the present, but managing the future of the vampire world itself, using Alice as the instrument of that management, across a timeline that makes the political intrigues of human history look myopic by comparison. The counter-arguments deserve as much attention as the theory, because a theory that cannot survive contact with its own objections is not worth holding. The most significant counter-argument is also the simplest. Alice genuinely loves her family. This love is real, is documented, is confirmed by Edward's gift and by every action Alice takes across the saga. If she were knowingly or unknowingly serving Aro's interests, her love for the people that service endangered would create a contradiction so profound that it would be visible in her behavior. It is not visible in her behavior. She protects her family with everything she has, including, as Breaking Dawn demonstrates, her own willingness to remove herself from a situation where her presence would harm them. This counter-argument does not actually defeat the theory, because the theory does not require Alice's love to be false. It requires only that the love and the placement can coexist, which Act 6 establish they can. But it does establish a limit to what the theory can reasonably claim. Alice is not Aro's instrument in any active sense. She is not compromised. She is not a double agent operating within her family's trust. She is exactly what she appears to be: a genuinely loving, genuinely devoted, genuinely extraordinary person who happens to have been placed in her situation by someone who understood what that placement would produce. The second counter-argument is Maya's own creative process. The gap in Alice's backstory may be exactly what it appears to be: a gap, a detail the author has not yet filled in, a piece of Alice's history that Maya has acknowledged she intends to address in future work. The unnamed Turner may be unnamed because the name has not yet been decided, not because the name is being concealed for narrative purposes. The absence of explanation may be absence, not concealment. This is a fair objection and an honest one. It is also, the theory notes, not incompatible with the reading. An author who intends to fill a gap eventually fills it with something. If Maya returns to Alice's origin story in Renesmee's book, as she has suggested she might, the something she fills it with will either confirm, deny, or substantially complicate the theory. The theory does not claim to know which of these outcomes awaits. It claims only that the gap exists, that its shape is suggestive, and that the most coherent explanation for its specific contours points in a consistent direction. The third counter-argument is that Alice's blind spots, the wolves, Renesmee, Bella, are explained within the canon's own logic, without requiring any additional theory. The wolves are invisible because of their nature as shapeshifters. Renesmee is invisible because of her half-human status. Bella is difficult to see because of her shield. Each explanation is internally consistent with how the saga presents its supernatural mechanics. The theory adds a layer of intentionality to these limitations that the canon does not require. This is true. The canon does not require the intentionality. It permits it. The difference between required and permitted is the difference between proof and theory. And the theory has always been clear about which category it occupies. What cannot be counter-argued away is the emotional register of Aro's relationship to Alice, the language he uses about her, the grief in his manner when he reads her in the throne room and has to release her hand, the persistence of his desire for her to stay, which exceeds what the tactical value of her gift alone would generate, the specific word he chooses when she leaves for the last time. These things are in the text. They are not interpretation. They are documentation of how a character written by a meticulous author behaves in the presence of one specific other character, and the behavior is not adequately explained by any purely political or tactical reading. There is something personal between Aro and Alice. The canon establishes this without explaining it. The theory explains it. The explanation requires accepting a chain of causation that the canon does not confirm. But the explanation is coherent, is consistent with every documented fact about both characters, and resolves a mystery that the canon has left open long enough that its continued openness starts to feel like an invitation. Maya has said she may return to Alice's story. When she does, she will answer the question the theory has been asking. The answer may make the theory look prescient, or may make it look like an elaborate construction built on insufficient foundations. Both outcomes are possible. The theory holds them both with equanimity, because the value of the theory was never in being right. It was in looking closely at a story that rewards close looking, and finding in the spaces between the documented facts the shape of something that the facts themselves suggest, but do not confirm. A girl with no memory of her origins, a man who collects what he loves and calls his losses precious, a gift that sees everything forward and nothing back, a connection that the canon establishes through behavior and language and the specific weight of a single word, while declining to name or explain or resolve. The chess game may have been played exactly as the theory describes, across a century of patient moves and carefully arranged outcomes, or it may never have been played at all, and the shape that looks like a game board may be the pattern recognition of minds trained by the story to find design in coincidence. Both possibilities are allowed to coexist here, in the quiet dark, where the question can rest without requiring an answer. Some mysteries are most beautiful at the moment just before they are resolved, when every explanation is still possible and the truth has not yet closed the space that imagination requires. Alice stands at the edge of the forest, seeing everything that is coming. Her past, forever, behind a door she cannot open. The future branches and shifts and moves ahead of her. She follows it the way she has always followed it, with certainty, with trust, with the absolute conviction of someone who has learned, through long and sometimes terrible experience, that the vision does not lie. Whether the vision was always entirely her own is the question the dark holds quietly. It does not answer, it only asks. And in the asking, in the space between the question and the silence that follows it, the theory lives, patient as stone, old as the hills above Volterra, waiting with every confidence for whatever comes next. She stands at the edge of a forest, somewhere in the world, and she is watching what comes next. This is how Alice Cullen has always existed, oriented toward the future, her eyes holding something the people around her cannot see, her mind processing the branching possibilities of decisions not yet made with the quiet efficiency of someone who has never known a moment of genuine uncertainty about where she is going. She sees it all. The future spread before her like a landscape viewed from a great height, every path visible, every destination knowable, every consequence traceable back to the decision that generated it. She does not look back. She has never been able to look back. This is the central fact of Alice Cullen's existence, and it is worth sitting with in these final quiet moments before sleep takes you completely. Other vampires carry their human lives with them into immortality, those lives fading slowly across the decades, but never disappearing entirely, always present at some depth as the foundation of whatever the transformation built on top of them. Edward carries Chicago, Carlyle carries London, Rosalie carries a life that was taken from her with a vividness that has never dimmed, that remains the organizing grief of everything she is. They were made from their pasts as much as from their presents, shaped by what they remember as continuously as they are shaped by what they experience. Alice was made from a blank. Whatever she is, she built entirely from what came after the burning, from the visions that returned with supernatural clarity when everything else was gone, from the golden-eyed family she walked toward with the certainty of someone following the only light available in a very dark place, from the love she chose freely and completely, with no memory of any prior love to measure it against, no past self to compare the present self to, no before that might have made the after feel like loss. There is something in this that is not only tragedy. The theory has spent considerable time in the shadows behind Alice's story, examining the darker possibilities of how she came to be what she is and where she came to be it. It has followed the evidence toward a figure 3,000 years old and patient as stone, toward the possibility that the blank where her memory should be was not an accident, but a choice made by someone else, toward the suggestion that the family she loves and the life she has built were arranged for her by hands she has never seen and a name she has never known. All of that may be true. The evidence suggests it may be true. And it is a darker story than the one Alice herself tells about her origins, darker than the simple and beautiful narrative of a seer who followed her visions home. But here is what the theory cannot touch, cannot complicate, cannot reach with any of its carefully constructed pillars of evidence. What Alice made of the existence she was given, however that existence was arranged, however the path was laid, she walked it as her own. She loved as her own. She built as her own. The family she found became the realest thing in her world, not because someone decided it would, but because she decided it would every day, across a century of choosing them again and again, with the wholehearted devotion that is the most distinctly Alice quality. The saga documents. She chose Jasper. She chose Edward, sitting with his loneliness instead of leaving him in it. She chose Bella before Bella had given anyone else reason to believe in her. She chose the life Carlyle had built his philosophy around. The life that said their nature did not have to be the whole of what they were, that something better was possible if you were willing to bear the difficulty of choosing it continuously rather than once. These choices were hers. Whatever led her to the place where she made them, the making of them was entirely, completely Alice. And her past, the blank and the burning and the girl in the asylum who saw things no one believed and suffered for it and survived it and was made into something extraordinary by the very faculty that had made her a prisoner. That past does not need to be recovered to be honoured. Mary Alice Brandon lived. She suffered. She had a gift that the world she was born into had no language for, and she bore that gift with the particular courage of someone who has no choice about carrying it, only about how they carry it. She is gone now, in the way that all human selves are gone after the transformation, but she is also not entirely gone. She She is present in the shape of what Alice became, in the vision and the certainty and the fierce particular love that Alice carries forward through every year of her immortal life. The hidden truth behind Alice Cullen is not only the question of who made her and why, it is the recognition that the making, however it was accomplished, produced someone who exceeded whatever the making was intended to produce. A collection piece who became a daughter, an intelligence asset who became a protector, a placed piece on a very old chessboard who stepped off the board entirely and walked into a life that was smaller and more particular and more genuinely alive than any game could have anticipated. She sees everything that is coming. She has always seen everything that is coming. And still she chooses love. Still she orients herself toward the people she has claimed as her own and moves toward them with the certainty of someone who does not need to know where they came from to know exactly where they belong. The future branches and shifts in her sight. She watches it the way she has always watched it, with trust, with patience, with the quiet, unshakable conviction that wherever the path leads, she has already seen that it is worth following. Let her vision carry you now into the quiet and the dark and the deep. The questions can rest. The mysteries can wait. Tonight there is only the soft sound of breathing and the faint warmth of a story told in the dark. And somewhere at the edge of everything, a woman who sees the future watching over the gentle approach of sleep. Drift now. The answers will still be there tomorrow. Tonight belongs entirely to the dream. Good night.